And welcome to another Hank Unplugged podcast, the podcast that's dedicated to bringing you the most interesting, informative, inspirational people on the planet, and also promoting books that I feel are absolutely must-reading. And let me say at the outset, if you're enjoying Hank Unplugged, make sure to leave a review wherever you listen to the podcast. When you do that, it really helps spread the popularity of the podcast. I want to say at the outset of this podcast that Western civilization is in the midst of a massive crowd derangement crisis. The grand meta-narratives of religious truth and political order are, well, I would say they're in an utter state of collapse. And filling the void is a new religious dogma of social justice, identity politics, and intersectionality. Truth itself is routinely sacrificed on the altars of this unholy trinity. And one quick example before we get to our guest. It's an illustration of how students in the West increasingly perceive truth. And here's how some of the students talk about it. This is a quote that comes directly from The Madness of Crowds, in which students write this: "The idea that there is a single truth, or the truth, is a construct of the Euro-West, a construct that is deeply rooted in the Enlightenment." Of course, the Enlightenment was a movement that also described black and brown people as both subhuman and impervious to pain. This construction is a myth, and white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism, and the United States of America are all its progeny. The idea that truth is an entity for which we must search in matters that endanger our abilities to exist in open spaces is an attempt to silence oppressed people. In other words, truth is a fabrication by white people constructed for the subjugation of black and brown people. And this idea has become so entrenched that white professors now often begin their lectures by asking forgiveness for the very fact that they are white. There's one example in the book of a professor. Her name is Robin DiAngelo. She's of Boston University, and she begins one of her talks by saying, "I'd like to be a little less white," which means a little less oppressive, oblivious, defensive, ignorant, and, of course, arrogant. This new orthodoxy is pontificating that genders are fluid, that women are better than men, that people can become white, but they can't become black, and that anyone who doesn't believe in all of this is an oppressor. So Douglas Murray, in the book Madness of Crowds, talks about all of these subjects and more. He talks about what it means to be gay, the new orthodoxy on gayness. He writes about the underpinnings of Marxism in social systems. Not the least of these social systems are constituted by universities. He talks about the confusing messages bandied about with respect to the identity of women, the impact of technology on societal structures, the codification of entire groups of people based solely on their racial characteristics, and so much more. He even writes about the liabilities of forgiveness in an age in which the internet militates against that very thing. And in terms of the present madness of crowds, little has become more useful than the transgender battering ram which is now being used to break down the last vestiges of what is perceived to be the great patriarchal wall of Western civilization. Well, Douglas Murray, he's a Renaissance man, quite frankly. He's a best-selling author. He's an award-winning journalist. He's based in Britain. He's the associate editor of The Spectator, and he has written regularly for publications like the Wall Street Journal, which I read cover to cover every single day, the Times, the National Review. His books include a really significant book titled The Strange Death of Europe. And I would say incidentally, or maybe not incidentally, that this book was almost 20 weeks on the Sunday Times bestseller list, and it was the #1 bestseller in nonfiction. That's an incredible barrier to overcome, to become #1 in nonfiction. And his latest book, and that's the book that I want to spend most of my time on today, is titled The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race, Identity. And I want to start the discussion with Douglas Murray on that very subject. Douglas, it is wonderful to have you on Hank Unplugged.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
You can tell I'm a big fan.
Very kind. It's reciprocated then.
Well, thank you. And let's start talking about this onerous religious trinity of social justice, identity politics, and intersectionality. A lot of people, when we talk about this, don't have a good working definition of what you're driving at. So what is social justice to start with?
Well, you're right. A lot of people don't know how to define it, but they certainly know when they see it and they feel it around them. What it is it's something between a religious movement and a political movement which seeks to weaponize all issues of identity and finds meaning in life by picking up identity battles and running with them very hard at anyone who is perceived even to be in their way. This is why increasingly in the media in recent years, and indeed in politics, the debates have become not about what politics used to be about, or indeed the media used to be about, but about people who have erred or strayed on specific new doctrines on sexuality, relations between the sexes, race, and a lot more. And so social justice is one of these terms that, of course, sounds beautiful. I mean, it sounds like it indeed has been set up in order to be unopposable. It's like multiculturalism. It sounds, what are you for? If you're against it, are you for uniculturalism? You know, if you're against social justice, you must be for social injustice. What it means is that by using these almost unopposable terms, people are able to smuggle in their own very doctrinaire political and social views. And at this stage, as I say, I think everybody feels it and can feel it around them, not least in the assertions that are made daily with which we cannot all agree.
And I think what you just said about social justice is not only spot on, but it also is very commensurate with this whole idea of identity politics.
Yes, that's right. It's a triumvirate, as you say. Identity politics is how you take this basically to the polls. Identity politics is identifying groups by, as I say, sexual orientation, sex, race, and a bit more, and saying that this is the defining feature of everybody who has that characteristic, and you then group them together for a political aim. So, for instance, you say, well, we're going to coalesce all women to vote in a particular way, or we will need to get the gays on side, or blacks, and so on. And it's an incredibly reductive method of politicking, but both formally, particularly in America, and more informally in community activism, it's become the defining identity groupings of our time. I mean, much more so than, for instance, the discussions we used to have until fairly recently on class politics, which had their own drawbacks, to be certain, but this is a replacement of that.
And then the third, and I think in your book, if I recall correctly, you talk about this as being the most unhealthy part of this triad or this trinity, and that is the word intersectionality. Explain to those listening in what that term connotes.
It's probably the ugliest word in the English language, with some of the ugliest connotations at this stage as well. It's an invention of American academia, I'm sorry to say, which claims that it takes up this first issue, the social justice issue, and it says, we must fight against burning injustice. But intersectionalism says, this theory says, that's been around for about 40 years or so, it's not enough to fight against one burning injustice. For all injustice in the world is interlocked, and we must fight against all injustices and work out where they are and where they interlock. Now, the claim is, as I say, that the whole of society is set up like an interweaving web of oppression, and that if we understand where these oppressions interconnect, we can undo them at the same time. So, for instance, we must, it's not enough to campaign for the right of trans people to live their lives. We must campaign for black trans women who are being murdered. And therefore, we must campaign for all of the racial, sexual, and gender issues that come along with that. And that you can only understand one of these things if you understand all. It presumes that we live in a very racist, patriarchal, cis-heteronormative, as the saying would go, societies, which are unbelievably oppressive, and that we don't really quite understand how oppressed we are, but we're more oppressed the more you look at it, the theory goes, and we've just got to keep digging down into this oppression until we overthrow the whole thing. This is an enormous set of presumptions, apart from anything else to make about a society like America or like Britain, where I'm from. But this is the intersectional claim. It perceives life as a set of struggles to overthrow oppressions. And as I say, it means that people can throw themselves into battles that have nothing to do with their own lives, but that's precisely why it makes them even more virtuous when they engage in such battles.
I love the way that your book is outlined. You have 4 major chapters. You have a chapter on gay, one on women, one on race, and one on trans. And then between those chapters, you have interludes, one being the Marxist Foundations, the next being the impact of technology, the third being on forgiveness, which is very fascinating. I want to get into that in a little while. And then a conclusion to the entire book. I want to start out with that first chapter in which you write about how rapidly perspectives on marriage are changing. And one of the illustrations that you underscore in this chapter is the idea of same-sex marriage. So you have Hillary Clinton, back at the time that her husband was proffering the Defense of Marriage Act, she was standing behind that lockstep with her husband. Then when she ran for office in 2016, she was standing diametrically opposed to this. And I suppose that underscores how rapidly our culture is transitioning, and how if you have happened to say something in the past, even if that past is fairly recent, you have a tripwire there that can blow you up pretty quickly.
Yes, that's right. I give the example of Joy Reid, who was found a couple of years ago to have done a tweet 10 years earlier in which she had expressed her reservations about gay marriage. And at the time she tweeted that was quite common to be, not in favor of gay marriage. And it was just very interesting that within a decade, this was enough to put her career in serious peril. And what I'm interested in about this really is it's a very good signal of the speed at which we are shifting our views. By the way, I happen to be in favor of gay marriage in a civil context. What I say is, and what I think I mentioned in that chapter is, there's a very interesting boot on the other foot test here. Because if it is the case, and I give an example of an event I attended, a Christian event in London, which was basically hounded out of venues it was trying to organize in, if we end up in a situation of saying that people who are not in favor of gay marriage, which includes, as I say, most people until very recently, if in this era, it becomes impermissible to hold a view that was held very commonly until yesterday. We are doing something very dangerous. We are doing actually something profoundly illiberal. And we are saying that the mores of our time happen to have changed very radically on a set of things, whether for the good or for the worse is in people's own views, but that as they change, we will be totally unforgiving of anyone who doesn't come along lockstep with it 100% of the way. That, as I say, is a profoundly illiberal thing. It is not the job, for instance, of rights campaigners of any kind, writers or anyone else, to tell congregations or leadership of churches and other religious institutions to go along with views that those institutions do not, and in many cases cannot hold. And as I say, I give the gay marriage one because it's a fascinating window into this. The unforgivingness of our time, the unwillingness to allow a variety of genuinely various and dissenting opinion, and the desire effectively just to jump orthodoxies, where yesterday we had one, today we'll have a new one. And woe betide you if you're not on the right side today.
You self-identify as gay, is that correct?
That's right, yes.
And I'm wondering, when you write about the problems with the gay agenda or the gay movement at various junctures, does that give you more credibility or less credibility in terms of the broader swath of the people that you're trying to speak to?
I've no particular idea because I never write like that and I never think like that. I've always tried as a writer to say what I think is true, and that has always led me into lots of problems. This one throws up one. I decided to do the gay chapter first because, in a way, one of the reasons was that there's a foundational thing there that the readers of the book will discover that is needed to be explained. But the, as it were, tactical reason of doing it first was to say, look, I am willing to say and speak and think absolutely openly and freely and, through very difficult terrain on the only one of these identity questions that actually treads on my life. So if I'm willing to do it on the one that, that I could claim to be involved with, then do trust me that I'm going to do the same thing on others, and that when I do it on others, it's with no nefarious intent. You have to prove to people these days that you're not some, hidden homophobe, racist, sexist, et cetera, et cetera. And I wanted to show people, as it were, to build confidence with my readers, to say, look, the fact is there's an awful lot of stuff we don't know about, and there's an awful lot of stuff we do know about, which we pretend not to know about. And there's an awful lot of just very complex things which we ought to not pretend are simple or straightforward. It just isn't the case, for instance, that LGBT is just a sort of happy mini alphabet that requires no further elucidation or thought. It's not the case, as I say in the chapter about relations between the sexes, that things are quite as straightforward as we sometimes pretend today, nor, by the way, is it quite as complex as we are telling a new generation that it is.
Talk about the current dogma that being gay is wholly inbuilt and an unmovable state of being. This is something I was fascinated to see you write about very, very candidly. This is a dogma. It's a dogma that is being communicated broadly, but you're saying that this is not settled science by any stretch of the imagination.
That's right, it isn't. And this, of course, makes a lot of people incredibly uncomfortable. But, I'm interested in things that make us uncomfortable because those are the things that are interesting. Yes, within most of our lifetimes, there was a commonly heard phrase that was used about being gay, which was that it was a lifestyle choice. And that was particularly came from religious figures. There was something off with it which a lot of people could notice, which was that if it was a lifestyle choice, why would people choose it? Because it makes, arguably, certainly in the past, it made people's lives rather more difficult than they needed to be. So it was an odd thing to choose. Now, as it happens, over the decades, we've come to a different settlement, which is what I jokingly describe as the Lady Gaga agreement, which is born this way. Now, as I say, the book came out actually just weeks before the largest study into this ever carried out was carried out by some American academics, and it actually bolstered the argument I make in the book, which is basically we don't really know, even at this stage, we don't really know why some people, it's a fairly consistent proportion of the population across the globe, we don't really know why some people are attracted to their own sex. And it's a very complex area. It's highly unlikely we're going to discover a single gay gene, but it's also, by both the American and British psychological associations' views, could involve some combination of genetics and issues to do with life experience. So what I say is, since we don't know very much about this, and by the way, I should stress, this has nothing to do with, depriving anyone of rights or anything like this, but I say, since we don't know very much about this, ought our societies to be leaning quite so hard on a presumption which we actually aren't sure about? Ought we to be quite so assertive about things that actually remain slightly opaque? Now, I completely understand why campaigning groups, for instance, might want to pretend that we know more about the science than we do. But it's just not quite honest. And here is one of the problems with it, is that if you, it's always been my observation throughout the many books and articles I've written throughout my life so far, that there's a great danger in leaning heavily on things that you don't know enough about. What it allows, among other things, is for other people to come in and also assert things based on not enough evidence. And this is happening at the moment in the trans debate in particular, where claims are being made about trans, which, like the gay debate, are saying, we know that this is actually what I describe as a hardware issue, a hardware as opposed to software. That is something you can do nothing about. The trans debate has learnt from the gay debate and says, we're going to try to do the same thing, which is to show, of course, it's not a choice to be trans. In fact, we're born this way, and there's nothing we can do about it, and that's why you have to give us everything that we want. That's a fascinating move. And you can tell that some of the giveaway signs, among others, are the fact that now in the trans debate, there is almost no discussion of sexual enjoyment. It's absolutely the other way around. There is an audition to prove that this has nothing to do with sex. And that's a huge giveaway because, of course, it's an attempt to gain advantage based on pretending on that case with the trans one, something we know much less about even than the gay one.
And that train has moved with vast rapidity across the landscape, plowing down anyone that doesn't adhere to this particular paradigm.
Well, can I just add to that? I mean, if you watched the Democrat Party's LGBT town hall at the end of last year, I think in November last year, all the main candidates, including Elizabeth Warren, are on stage, and there was at least one parent in the crowd, I think two, with a trans child. Now, I'm very, very uncomfortable about this, the idea there are trans children. And, Elizabeth Warren and the other Democrats were nodding all this along and actually applauding it. And I just watch this and I think, wow. I mean, we have had none of the discussion we would need to have to get anywhere near that kind of certainty.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Something you alluded to earlier that I want to delve into a little more deeply, and that is the initialization of LGBTQ plus, etc., the alphabet that you alluded to. When you think about this and when it's developed into an acronym form, so often you suppose that this has to be some kind of a harmonious community and that everyone in the community has the precise same objective. But I think that you point out rightly in the book that this is pure mythology. Yes.
Well, it's the case to some degree with all attempts to group people by characteristics. I mean, I mentioned earlier the disappearance of the class discussion, or at least the diminution of the class discussion. If somebody said to you, I love the working class, or I love the middle class, I would say, who are you talking about? Who? I can think of some very nice working class friends, and I can think of some people that I don't particularly like. I can think of very smart middle class people and some very dumb ones. Why would you group these people and make a claim just like that? Now, it's even worse when it comes to identity politicking. People say, LGBT people think X. And you go, who are you talking about? Which ones? It's the extraordinary presumptuousness, which we also see. Again, we see it with the discussion, in particular in the American social sphere and in politics, about women. Women want X. Oh, yeah? What, all women? Which ones are you thinking of? And on it goes. Black voters X. And I think this is just very dangerous in all of these cases, because I take a completely opposite view to that, which takes the view that it is the individual that is sovereign in the society, and that the individual who is the marker. And that while it's true that identity traits such as your sexuality or sex or race may well have some bearing in your life, to think it is the only signifier of meaning is, apart from anything else, a profound reduction of what we are as human beings.
You know, I was thinking as you just said that, in the debate that just took place, I think the day before yesterday, the Democratic debate, this phrase black and brown people is used over and over again, as though people ought to be characterized as a result of their pigmentation, as opposed to being characterized by the content of their character, as Martin Luther King Jr. once put it.
That's right. As you know, in the chapter on race, I cite this as one of the, I think, probably the most terrifying development of our time. The way in which, over the course of half a century, we've actually completely unwoven and reversed the dream of Dr. King. That central moral insight that he made and gave us half a century ago is being unwoven as we speak and run against in the name of anti-racism by people who profess to be opposed to generalization on skin pigmentation and other characteristics, but who are saying, no, the one thing that matters most is your skin color, your racial origin. And I think that, among other things, this is not just reductive, but profoundly dangerous. It's dangerous in the same way that it's dangerous when people make generalizations against all men, for instance. It has happened in the past with women, and it has happened in the past with people who are black, for instance. One of the most fascinating things about our species in the last century or so is our ability to identify a problem and, instead of solving it, to just switch it around and apply the problem in a different direction. So that just as there was a time when some people were allowed to make claims against all women and get away with it, or about all women and get away with it, so today people can make allegations against all men and get away with it. In exactly the same way, 1 century ago, it was possible for people, outrageously, to make wild, sweeping claims about people who were black because of the color of their skin. And today, that is quite rightly viewed as racist and unacceptable. But yet it remains not just acceptable, but actually lauded if people make claims about white people because of their color of their skin. You know, white people are so X. I give example after example in the book, and it alarms me in the same way that the generalizations against the male sex alarms me, because it suggests to me that we are preparing and indeed lining up some horrible return of racial politics.
Yeah, I think the examples that you give in the book are downright terrifying. I want to get back to this rejiggering that's taken place in terms of the gay alphabet. Once the moniker was GLB, and now it's become LGB, and then the other letters TQ, etc. Why? Why has that changed?
Oh, well, it's a slightly boring thing, but what happened was that L was put first because lesbians claimed that they were being marginalized, so it got preference. Gay and bi, it makes sense. Well, as I say, actually, you know, the idea this all goes harmoniously along together in a happy car, as an American comedian put it recently, and that everyone just sort of gets along in the LGBT car is not accurate. But it's that last one, the addition of T, that's particularly interesting, which I go into in the last chapter. But also this one Q that has been added. Q for queer gives a very, very big giveaway. You see, I say in the book, I think I'm the first person to have made this point, that there is a difference between gay and queer. Gay is people who happen to be attracted to their own sex. Queer is people who believe that being attracted to their own sex is merely the first stage in some wider political campaign. to, for instance, wage war on the patriarchy. It's always the same campaign, by the way. Wage war on the patriarchy and the oppressive white cis heteronormative power structures. You also have people who claim that being queer, as it were, it also means you've got to wage war on, I don't know, capitalism, for instance. And I jokingly say occasionally, well, I didn't get that starter pack. It's the same. It's the same with some feminism. I mean, I stress in each of these cases there is extraordinary similarity of what the radicals are really after. There are first and second wave feminists who completely reasonably, decently, and indeed admirably, brilliantly explained how women needed to be able to be freer in societies like yours and like mine, and how there were definitely sectors of our societies in which they were held back and indeed prejudiced against, and opportunities that weren't open to them. And we all know that from within our lifetimes or just before. There are, however, then feminists who aren't interested in that bit and who say, no. To be a woman is not to be equal to men, which is how most of us would like simply to view it. It's not enough to say that women are equal to men. Women must use being a woman as simply the first stage in pulling down the oppressive power structures of our time, and then, defeating the white, cis, heteronormative, patriarchal power structures and also capitalism along the way. And I think you can see exactly the same thing. I trace exactly the same thing in what has happened since the civil rights movement, where, again, there are people who argue, no, being black is not just about being equal with being white or any other skin color. Being black is simply the first stage to pulling down the power structures, including capitalism and so on. And I think that, it's necessary to identify this and to identify the common things that are going on here, because to do so is, apart from anything else, to try to start to get out of the argument these people are trying to invite us into, which is to view societies like America and Britain as especially unfair, especially in need of some kind of social and indeed economic revolution. And this is an organized campaign by now. It's an organized sort of social thought. It's being taught and has been taught for more than a generation to young Americans. And it needs to be singled out and critiqued.
Reading your book, you strike me as someone that's willing to follow truth wherever it leads. And in that vein, I was very interested to read in your book your quotation of Daniel Mendelsohn. I think the book was called The Elusive Embrace. And in that book, and you have a quotation in that book, I can't recall all of it, but basically Mendelsohn is saying that sex between men dissolves otherness into sameness, and concludes that since the object of that knowledge is already wholly known to each of the parties, the act is also redundant. And then he concludes that perhaps that is the reason that so many of us keep seeking repetition as if depth were impossible. That seems to be a scathing analysis of the gay condition. And yet you quote it.
Yes. I mean, I quote it. I think it's one of the very few times I've seen somebody who themselves is gay writing about this. I don't entirely agree with the quote. What I'm interested in about it is that it reveals something, and it speaks to something very interesting. And this really comes, again, across all of the issues I'm writing about in The Madness of Crowds. One of the questions I think is most interesting is we talk in the people that I'm, running against in this book talk about us as human beings as if we have prejudices and views which can be conquered and got over for all time. Now, one of the things I say at the end of the gay chapter in The Madness of Crowds is, what if there is actually something slightly unnerving about male homosexuality in particular, which it doesn't justify bigotry, again, it doesn't justify any kinds of, hatred or anything. But to say there are things that people find slightly unnerving, and maybe we just have to accept that that's the case. Let me give you another example. People talk about some men being misogynists. What do we call a man who's had, for instance, a particularly bitter and unpleasant divorce, has been totally taken through the ringer by his wife in a way that isn't fair, and as a result has, let's say, generalizing views that are sour about women and their likelihood of being able to have a successful relationship with them. Do we say that person is a misogynist? And if so, do we pretend as if it's some totally abnormal thing that has happened to them rather than an ugly consequence of an ugly thing that has happened in their lives? And again, doesn't mean it's acceptable or nice to be generalizing about women, doesn't mean they should be derogatory about them, but, this happens. Let me flip it around onto the race one. Let's say there is a black person who has had a horrible experience of racism from a white person. Let's say somebody in their 70s or 80s now who actually, remembers an era where it was, racial relations in America were worse than they are now. If that person actually has an unpleasant suspicion of white people, and even worse, maybe almost a dislike of white people, do we simply call that person a racist and anathematize them, or do we say it's ugly, it's very unpleasant, they have their own reasons for feeling the way they do, and we wouldn't want other people to feel like that, and we really hope it's not perpetuated, but we don't treat them just like some abnormal alien who got there from nowhere. And I think this points to a really complex and difficult truth, which is that this idea that we identify certain human beings as homophobic, transphobic, racist, misogynist isn't quite right. It's not quite enough. Apart from anything else, it's not accurate and it's not quite helpful, because we're all a bit more complex than that. We all have our own experiences, and we fluctuate within our lives. And it seems to me that, funnily enough, this era of celebrating difference and all that sort of thing isn't actually very tolerant of the fact that we are all a bit more complex than we pretend.
Yeah, that's beautifully stated. Let me move on to your first interlude, which has to do with Marxist Foundations. I wonder if you can elaborate on the Marxist Foundations of identity politics and particularly intersectionality.
Yes. One of the things I say that is most interesting in this is that there are very clear substructures we can now identify. One of them is, as I say, the Marxist substructure, which is underneath all of what I'm describing in this book. This isn't to say that everybody who follows this is a Marxist. A lot of people follow it totally unknowingly. But that there is a Marxist interpretation of history, and indeed a Marxist interpretation of individuals, which is clearly running underneath a lot of this. It is, among other things, the interpretation of life through almost solely through the lens of power. Who has power, how you can acquire it from them, and how it could be more equitably distributed. These are deeply Marxist views to start from, and they have, as I say, interwoven throughout the intersectionalist version of understanding our societies. There's a lot more. One of them is the point I make that I trace some of the almost unreadable, but nevertheless I had to read them, post-Marxist and neo-Marxist writers from the latter half of the 20th century, who, as communism was falling apart, started to realize that they had to come up with a new way of understanding society. And the way they come up with is to say, look, the working class in countries like America fundamentally let us down. They never turned up for the revolution in significant enough numbers. So this doesn't mean, and it's always important to remember this, the Marxists never think that failure of their project means that the project is a failure. It simply means that we've got to find a new way to make it work, and it will one day. The people who pushed this in the latter half of the last century, among other things, go through this by saying, because the working class let us down, we must now look for new client groups. And we must draw on, and they are completely frank about this, and I quote them, we must, for instance, draw on sexual minorities, we must draw on women as a group, and we must draw on racial minorities. And these people, these groupings, will be the new vanguard who will this time successfully bring about the Marxist society that these people would like. As I say, a lot of people, particularly, students who've just unfortunately been indoctrinated on American campuses, don't know this is what they've imbibed. But it's perfectly possible, and we all know examples in the world of ideas, of people who've simply drunk from wells deeper than they know.
That's absolutely right. I don't know if you want to get into this, but what about democratic socialism? Is that an oxymoron to take democratic and place it in front of the word socialism?
Well, you would have said so, but you could argue that the history of certain center-left parties across Europe shows that as a term it means something slightly different than it would mean. I don't want to be too pure philosophically about this, but it meant a particular thing, and it could be argued that it now means something slightly different, which is effectively a form of center-leftist politicking. I'm thinking of parties like those in Germany and elsewhere in the post-war period. And the same thing with some Christian socialist parties, you could say, so that today it means something slightly different. But in the proper interpretation of it that one would have had in the past, no, they are very significantly contradictory.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the people that you reference in the book, and I think rightly so, someone that we ought to know a whole lot more about, is Michel Foucault and his predilections to power and contradiction. In fact, one of the things that I found really fascinating in the book is how you expose the predilection to taking words, stringing them together in such a way that if you read them, you think, this must be profound, but I have no idea whatsoever what this writer's talking about. And you're pointing out that this is purposeful.
Yes, there are various writers I use. I mean, my own belief as a writer is that the point of using words is to try to, among other things, not just get to truths, but also to get to them in a way that makes complex things more easily understandable than they previously were. As a reader, that's something I appreciate in writers, and as a writer, it's something I strive to do. What's interesting is that a lot of the intersectionalist identity politics writers, in fact, all of them, write about really often quite simple ideas and make them sound unnecessarily complex. And that's because they try to sound cleverer than they are, and they try to present very, very basic misunderstandings as being incredibly complex because it suits their purposes, and among other things, it suits their vanity. Another reason, of course, is that they have nothing to say, and that is the case on occasion, and I give examples of that. People who use language so opaque that it's clear that they are hiding the fact there is nothing to say, or where they deliberately use language so complex and knotty that it seems that they're trying to hide something. And that's the case with the variations of these three. Is the case with almost the entirety of the sort of intersectionalist literature. And if you come at it as I do, and say, I'm a fairly well-read, literate person, and I think that this sentence means nothing, whose fault is it, mine or yours? I'm confident enough with American scholar after American scholar to make it clear the problem is theirs, not mine. One does not read a novel of Dostoevsky or Vasily Grossman and need to reread a sentence many times over, and even then still be able to make no sense of it. However, Judith Butler and other gender theorists in America are writing sentences repeatedly that you can read repeatedly and still make no sense. Is this because Judith Butler is revealing truths more complex than Grossman and Dostoevsky? I think not. But it needs to be called out because I think a lot of people are intellectually bullied effectively by these people and are made to feel like they don't know anything, when the fact is it's the gender theorist who is the culprit and the responsible one.
You say that the purpose of large sections of academia today has ceased to be discovery or dissemination of truth. Instead, it's become the creation and the nurture of a particular, even a peculiar brand of politics. The purpose was not academia, you write, but activism. Expand on that.
I'm afraid this is a particular problem in the American universities. It has, to some extent, infiltrated the British universities and universities in Australia and elsewhere. But it's a particular problem in American academia. And I'm afraid I'm going to be extremely judgmental now. I have quite a lot of experience of American universities and a lot of experience of reading American scholars. And I'm afraid that something is happening which is effectively similar to a Ponzi scheme. American academia causes students to run up very large amounts of debt now, often debt that they cannot repay. Parents remortgage their houses to send their children away to school. And
by the way, Douglas, let me just interrupt you for a second. I know all about that. I have 12 children. So
wow. Well, you certainly know about that then. And one of the questions in this is, what exactly is the good that they are acquiring? Now, there are, of course, courses, I think particularly in the hard sciences, where you can't get away with very much lying. In the humanities, that isn't the case. And in the liberal arts, that isn't the case. And effectively, people are being persuaded to run up large amounts of debt in non-disciplines and studying ideas and being encouraged simply to repeat ideas, which I'm afraid are not true. One of the reasons I wrote The Madness of Crowds was to give people, particularly students — I'm very lucky in having a lot of brilliant young readers and listeners. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to say, look, I want you not to waste any of your life on this crap, or at least as little of it as possible. Don't fall for it. Have the intellectual confidence. Let me help you give you the intellectual confidence, if needed, to see through the things that are being asserted by some of your professors. You know, there is no call for people doing whiteness studies. There is only a job market within the place that perpetuates these myths, that is, within a certain type of academia. And I think that this needs calling out, because apart from anything else, we really do need to stop young people in America in particular from being sold a lie and being invited into a Ponzi scheme, which is going to crash.
I want to shift to the next major chapter in your book. It's a chapter on women. And in that chapter, you note a mega shift that's taken place in the culture. And this mega shift has taken place with vast rapidity. So, for example, you note that in 2014, unwanted sexual advances were considered, well, sort of adorable, but all of that changed in just 3 years when we have the advent in, I think it was 2017, of the Me Too movement and the case of Harvey Weinstein. So what was once considered adorable and acceptable on television now becomes an anathema.
That's right. It's another example of what I described earlier, of the behaviors changing faster than we're willing to recognize they're changing, and pretending that we all held views that we didn't hold till yesterday. And yes, the sexual etiquette one is an absolutely fascinating one. By the way, one of the reasons why this is so unpleasantly fought and why it's so vociferously argued over at the moment, and so I think vindictively discussed in a way, is that the worst place in the world to try to base sexual ethics on is Hollywood. It's just a disastrous starting base. You know, this is the world that gave us the term casting couch. You know, casting couch didn't emerge as a term from primary school teaching. It didn't emerge as a term in, you know, the finance world. It emerged in Hollywood for a reason. And that's just one example. But the attempt in recent years to try to base male-female relations on what Hollywood does is a disaster, both in what Hollywood was doing 5 years ago as well as what it would seek to do now.
That's absolutely right. And talking about Hollywood, you have people like Ellen, someone so famous now that all you need is one word. And she, on the one hand, is very strident against the notion of objectification that exists all over the place, and certainly the major boogeymen are men. But she herself can get away with objectification statements with respect to females. So there seems to be a double standard, which becomes very, very difficult to negotiate.
We are deeply confused on this. And, my chapter on relations between the sexes, I say things that I have so many friends and people who've said to me, "Oh, I'm so relieved you said that. I couldn't." But it tries to open up things which we're just being dishonest about, such as the idea there's only one form of power in the world, and that's male power. And I say, well, what about the fact that there are many forms? Let's pretend that power is the most important way to view our species. Are there not forms of power that women can wield more than men? The answer is yes, obviously. That's a very dangerous discussion to have these days. Nevertheless, it remains a discussion worth having, because there are a number of truths in that we are highly reluctant to acknowledge, but nevertheless are there.
There's something else that you talk about, and I don't know if you talk about it in this chapter or somewhere else, but I remember you talking about fake news headlines, like gay marriages are less likely to break up than straight marriages. And this is based supposedly on academic peer-reviewed studies. And the implication is that gays are better than straight people. And even though you identify as gay, you have a great aversion to this kind of fakeness.
Well, yes. One of the things that I say throughout the book is that what has happened in recent decades is that on each of these issues, a historical wrong has been to some extent righted. I think this is the case in women's liberation. I think it's the case in gay rights and the gay rights movement. I think it's clearly the case, particularly in America, with civil rights. And one of the things that is happening in our era is that each of these issues has passed equal and gone to something like better. Mm-hmm. Now, I understand why that has happened. It has happened as some form of overcorrection, so that if there was a time fairly recently when women were viewed to be less than men, let's go to an era for a bit where we pretend that they're better than men. What Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, once described as the layman sisters issue. She said, if it was layman sisters rather than layman brothers, perhaps the bank wouldn't have collapsed. The question you have to ask to which is why? What is it that women do that's magically better in finance than men? But there's an awful lot of things in the culture where that has been done. Women, having been viewed as being lesser than men, can now be viewed, at least for a period, as better. Gay people, having been seen as being lesser than straight people for a time, must now be seen as being sort of magically better in certain ways, in certain areas. And of course, when it comes to issues to do with race, we see people wanting to make up for lost time over the period where people who were, for instance, black were seen as being lesser, by trying to sock it to the white people for a period of time. And I think this is profoundly dangerous because, as I say, if we are all in the midst of some kind of overcorrection, how could we identify it? When would we know we'd overcorrected for long enough? And who would lead us back to equal? This is a very, very major question, which I urge people of all political persuasions to think about.
Yeah, which you do very ably in the book. Douglas, I want you to talk about the impossible demands that our culture is making, particularly on men, which is the idea that a woman has to be allowed to be as sexy and sensual as she pleases, but she can't be sexualized. What's going on there? I mean, this whole idea that you can go from being a stripper one moment to Mother Superior the next moment. And in fact, in this vein, I want to ask you something which I was kind of shocked at. I looked at the first epigraph in your book, you note an epigraph by Nicki Minaj, and I couldn't, without reading the book, I couldn't figure out what that was all about. Why did you put that at the beginning of the book? And of course, when I read the book, I figured it out. But that particular epigraph says, "Oh my gosh, look at her butt. Oh my gosh, look at her butt. Oh my gosh, look at her butt. Look at her butt. Look at her butt." I couldn't figure out why is that in there, but that relates to the question that I just asked you.
Yes, and of course, as you know, the epigraph page in the book is a quote from Nicki Minaj and also one from G.K. Chesterton, which I thought worked well in conjunction with it. Chesterton said somewhere, "The special mark of the modern world is not that it is skeptical, but that it is dogmatic without knowing it." Now, my point here, and this particularly pertains to the chapter on the relations between the sexes, is that there are a whole set of dogmas that we're in which we don't acknowledge that we're in. And this specific one is in some ways one of the most fascinating. It is the dogma that you can entirely sexualize people and indeed encourage them to be sexualized and yet pretend that that is not what you are doing and that that is not what they are doing. I give the example throughout the book. Each chapter has an example of this, of what I describe as impossible demands. There's an impossible demand I refer to later on in the book of people complaining about being ridiculed who are patently ridiculous. It is not possible to demand that you're never ridiculed in your life, however non-ridiculous you are. But if you are a ridiculous person, the likelihood of being ridiculed is quite high. It goes back to one of those things, not very nice necessarily, but it's almost certainly impossible to ban. This specifically deranging one in relation to sex is that somebody can be as sexy as they can be, but must not be sexualized. And this is incredibly dangerous terrain because it takes us near the sort of terrain that occasionally an elderly judge has, got into disgrace for, of implying that a woman dressed a certain way might be asking for it, sort of thing. So this is very dangerous terrain. But one of the questions I ask is, just as saying that somebody should not be held responsible if they've sexually molested somebody simply because of the manner of clothing that the person that they've molested is wearing, it is a reasonable question to ask whether or not once somebody has thrown themselves wholesale into the self-sexualization game, whether they have the right to say, they have the right to say it, but whether it's a reasonable right to say, you have no right to sexualize me, to talk about me in a sexualized manner, and much more. And that's why I quote Nicki Minaj, because there's a song of hers called Anaconda, which I go into in the book. By the way, the reason I do that is because I think it's incredibly important in a book explaining something about our entire culture, that we cover everything from French philosophers who influenced it right all the way down, if you like, to Nicki Minaj, because these are things that millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people have imbibed across our culture. So what interests me about this is that this specific song of Nicki Minaj, she is incredible, that you just quoted from, she's incredibly sexualizing throughout it. It's all, videos of her backside and her female friends, and they're all hitting each other's bottoms and all this. It goes on and on interminably. But then there's this very interesting thing at the end where effectively she does this to a sort of, handsome black guy who's sitting in a chair, and she does a sort of stripper act for him. And at the very end of it, after she's just, basically molested him, he puts one hand very cautiously on her, and she flicks it away and walks out in a huff, as in, how dare you? How dare you think that just because I've been wrapping my, naked legs around you for the last 5 minutes, that I'm interested in that? I call all the shots. And this is a very uncomfortable but necessary to interrogate issue of our time, which is whether that's a fair way for a woman to behave, and whether it's fair to assume that men should be made to be in that cowering position. And there is a well-known meme of this historically, which is the sort of predatory female character. Now, we all know about predatory males, and men have done plenty of terrible things and will continue to do them. But there is a lack of desire or a lack of honesty about the fact that just as there can be predatory men, so there can be predatory women. And it is exactly that sort of thing that our culture has decided to forget. And it's decided to forget it for the same reason that it's decided to skip motherhood and the whole question of motherhood in the feminist area, which is it's such a big thing, such a difficult thing, that we decided to skip it in order to go on to easier ones.
Yeah, and there's a lot more that could be said about that. And you do say that in your book, The Madness of Crowds. And another reason that this book is must-reading. And I got to, just as an aside, say that this book was actually put into my hands by one of my many children. And they're saying, Dad, this is a book that you need to read. And I read the book, and after I read the book, I said, this is not only a book that I need to read, this is a book that I need to make available to people who are supporters of the Ministry of the Christian Research Institute. And again, you can get a copy for supporting our work on the web at equip.org. I want to transition into something that is related to what we're talking about, Douglas, and that is the overview that you provide in the book on the history of feminism. The first wave, the equal rights wave, and then the second wave, which included the abortion perspective, and then the third wave, the claim that although rights had been achieved, progress was being rolled back. And then the fourth wave, which culminated in this idea that everything good is female and everything bad is male. And oftentimes you hear the moniker now, men are trash. So the question becomes, why would the rhetoric become so heated when the standards of equality have improved so dramatically? It doesn't make any sense.
Yes, it's a very, very interesting question, that. My own view that I've come to on each of these questions is that the situation is presented as being worse at the situation in which it's never been better. And there's a very obvious reason for that. So, I mean, for instance, to skip on to the race chapter, I quote Ta-Nehisi Coates, probably the most celebrated writer of his generation of any racial background. Ta-Nehisi Coates is an enormously lauded writer, receiver of a MacArthur Fellowship and much more. And he's a very talented individual. But one of the things that's fascinating about him is that his presentation of racial politics in America in our time is more accusing and in many ways more bitter than James Baldwin, who I enormously admire as a writer, and a quite extraordinary moral force himself. But why should it be the case that Coates should be portraying America in a worse light, effectively in a more impossible to redeem light than Baldwin was half a century or more earlier? Why is it the case that fourth wave feminists use things like kill all men and men are trash, which first wave feminists, who really had a lot of points, would not have used? I mean, the suffragettes would have massively damaged their argument, even further than some of the extremists in it did at the time. But they would have massively damaged their argument if they'd used slogans like those utilized by fourth wave feminists. So I think what's happening is that the situation in which things have never been better, they are portrayed as though they'd never been worse by people who, among other things, wish to have the moral clout that has been afforded to people who were actually there for the genuine rights struggles. So, they want to have the kind of moral aura that might understandably circle, say, a second wave feminist who defended women, who were being abused by their husbands and had no way out, for instance, or the moral aura that may have been given to people who were with Martin Luther King in the March on Washington. They want part of this, but the situation's far better than it was then. So how do they get that moral aura? Easiest by portraying things as if they've never been worse.
And how do you get away with that?
By hoping that people are very ignorant, and that's not a bad bet.
It isn't a bad bet because we have no sense whatsoever of history. And I think that's one of the systemic problems. And perhaps that's a good segue into your interlude on technology. Technology has robbed us in some sense of the ability to think because we are bombarded with so much information that we hardly have an opportunity to process that information. So I want you to talk about how innovations in technology are actually exacerbating the madness of crowds, as you put it, the massive impact of the internet and social media on our culture.
It's a huge thing because, of course, what we're going through, it's very hard to analyze as we're going through it, and we lose sight of much of it. But the thing that's worth bearing in mind is that we live in an age where people may make a mistake and will never be forgotten for making it. And this, among other things, is a colossal change in the way in which we view ourselves and each other. We have the capability with social media and with the internet, search engines and much more, to find out the one time that somebody has most slipped up in their life and to hold it ever before them and before ourselves. And this alone is a colossal change, not just in communications, but in our attitudes towards life. For all of our problems to ever be before us is a colossal shift. I mean, the idea that, for instance, you may make I'm thinking of a poem by Gaddafi called The City Will Follow You, Gaddafi says at one point. We are in this situation where you may make a mistake in a town. You may ruin your life in that town. And you may move to another town, but you'll find that your past follows you. And you may move to a different city or a different continent, and it will follow you. That's a massive shift in human affairs, the inability to start afresh, for instance. I could go on and on about this. The main point about this that is of most significance, particularly for parents and young people, is what does this do to our sense of what the world is now? There are a lot of people in America in particular who like to talk about snowflakes and how the next generation are, weak and all sorts of stuff like this. And I push back against that. I don't think that stuff's very fair. And it's not very fair, among other reasons, because it takes no account of the shift that has occurred in human affairs in our own lifetime. And the biggest part of that shift is the shift that means that a young person looks out onto this world in which if they slip up once, not just online, they may slip up at a social occasion, say the wrong thing, wear the wrong thing, and I give examples in the book of that happening. And before you know it, your error has gone around the world. And you were not a famous person before. You've become one now. Now, who would honestly blame a young person for looking out at that incredibly retributive and inquisitorial world and not be somewhat fearful of it? And then you add the second element to that, which is deepest and perhaps most important to consider, which is this. And this gets to a very deep substructure problem of our time. The only solution, I quote Hannah Arendt making this point, other philosophers have made it. It's an incredibly important time to consider the following. Human beings always had one massive challenge above all others, which was the irreversibility of our actions and the impossibility of knowing what our words and actions could lead to. We never could tell. Now, the only mechanism we have ever come up with as a species for addressing this is the mechanism of forgiveness. It's there in most of the major religions and philosophies, and it runs particularly strongly through the Christian tradition, which has a very, very deep understanding of the significance of forgiveness. Indeed, you might say redemption. Now, what is it to live in a world where action in the world has never been more perilous? That is, you make a joke, and instead of it just going down badly in the room, it goes down badly across the globe for all time in front of you, recorded forever, to give just one example. What is it to live in a world where action has never been more dangerous, and yet that same world pays no attention to the question of what a mechanism of forgiveness in our time would look like? And this is a very deep problem which causes much of the angst and the justifiable fear that many young people in countries like America growing up today feel. They know that they live in this retributive, inquisitorial culture which cancels and lambasts people for microaggressions. And yet that society spends no time trying to work out what anything like forgiveness would ever look like. And it's a terrifying prospect to survey that. And yet that is our situation.
And you did a masterful job of laying that out in the book, pointing out that part of forgiveness is the ability to forget. But as you have just elucidated, in an age in which the internet lie travels halfway around the world before truth has had the chance to put its boots on, the internet simply will not let us forget. I also, in light of the internet, want to talk about something that you highlight in the book, and that is the significant impact of social media giants like Twitter and Google and Facebook, which collectively impact our perspective on human sexuality, on race, we could say on the difference between men and women. They are leading us in particular directions, and oftentimes we're unaware of that.
Yes, that's right. I do an interlude chapter, as you know, on how tech is deranging us faster than anything else. It's doing something that much of the media is already pushing along, but it's doing it at a much faster and more frenetic pace. I give the example, which I hope people who read the book, enjoy, as well as realize quite how sinister it is, of Google Images. The fact that it will not give you what you ask for in certain searches. In other words, that almost all of the content we consume, including something so apparently inoffensive as a Google image search, is actually doctored to make sure that we imbibe precisely the social justice agenda that I pick apart and try to expose and undo in this book. It's an extraordinary story, and I really hope that people unveil it for themselves and find out what I describe and try it out for themselves, because it is like seeing a quasi-totalitarian, soft totalitarian agenda at work.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about your chapter on race. One of the things I found fascinating about that chapter is that, like gayness, race is now a political ideology. And you give a couple of examples. One is the example of Peter Thiel, who is no longer gay because, at least in the perspective of many people, he endorsed Trump and therefore he couldn't be gay. And Kanye West, he's no longer black because he's pandering to Republican distinctives. So instead of having this as a characteristic, or in some cases thought of as an identity, now it's a political ideology.
Yes, in each chapter I give an example of this. All of them were ones that just colossally influenced me and pushed me to realizing what was actually going on in our time. You know, that increasingly being gay wasn't about being gay. It was a political agenda that was being performed using gays as a sort of battering ram. It's a political agenda in lieu of actual campaign for racial equality. Let me give you an example, another one that comes up in the book. I quote the very, very interesting exchange that occurred on one of the main networks after, your listeners will remember the Rachel Dolezal case, a young American woman who had basically been pretending to be black. It was all one of the saddest as well as most amusing cases of recent years. But Rachel Dolezal, when she was exposed as actually being white and had been sort of pretending to be black by sort of frizzing her hair and lots of other quite, sort of would normally be seen as being rather stereotypical and ugly thing in itself. But anyway, Rachel Dolezal, when that was exposed, one of the most, sort of certainly outspoken, loudmouth, you might even say, not particularly distinguished thinker, admittedly, but a significant presence as well in the American racial politics scene, Michael Eric Dyson, is being interviewed on one of the main networks. And he's interviewed as a sort of prominent black leader. I hate using these terms, but if people do it themselves, then that's that. And Dyson is asked, do you think that Rachel Dolezal is black, basically? And he says she has imbibed the concerns of our community and taken on our issues and so on. And so I think, basically he said, yeah, if she's, and he says, I think most black Americans would have realized they had more in common with Rachel Dolezal than, say, Clarence Thomas. Now, that is a really remarkable statement, and it's not unusual, because what it suggests is that for somebody like Dyson, being black is not just, a question of, your parents happen to be black and both of them, and you happen to be black and, so what, you're an American and, much more. But rather, it says, no, being black is a political agenda to such an extent that a deeply distinguished American legal figure, such as Clarence Thomas, is deemed not to be black anymore because of his political leanings, whereas Rachel Dolezal, who isn't black, has the right to be considered black because she's a far leftist. Now, and has a particular, social justice agenda. That is an astonishing claim to have made, and it's not by any means unusual. And it reveals, as with the case of Peter Thiel in Gay, and as with the case of Kanye West and others in the chapter on race, it reveals that what is happening is that these innate characteristics are being used for something else, and the something else would appear to be, among other things, a deeply partisan political project.
Another thing that might be helpful to comment on, Douglas, is this growing field of scholarship, a field of scholarship that's taught in all Ivy League universities and is peculiarly aimed at the revelation of these supposed invisible structures that produce white supremacy and privilege, which leads to an issue that you address under the rubric of whiteness studies.
Yes, this is very. To a great extent, everything with studies after it at a university should not be taught because it isn't what it says it is. But there was an argument, you could say, in the past for black studies. I happen to think that the argument has eroded by now. But you could say that there were figures in history, and indeed writers in history, who had been marginalized or indeed even overlooked because of the color of their skin. And you could say the same thing, by the way, about some women's studies, and some women had been passed over because of their sex. You could say the same thing about certain gay figures in history. So each of these studies, black studies, women's studies, gay studies, you could say there was a time, at any rate, where they had some utility in bringing out people who might otherwise have been forgotten. I think to a great extent that utility is over because the whole sort of canon of remembering now in a country like America is very different and in many ways for the better than it was, say, a century ago. But the one study that is not about celebration and bringing out of figures is whiteness studies, a very sinister offshoot of critical race theory as practiced in the American Academy. And I did tell you that I'm afraid that so much of this is a responsibility of horrible, bad thinking on American campuses. But the whiteness studies thing is explicitly intended, states itself, as intending to, quote, problematize white people. That is just a horrifying thing to do, a horrifying way to basically inject racial resentment against groups of people based purely on the color of their skin. And at any rate, one of the things I say about this as a warning is watch out, because it's not clear to me that people will put up with forever being portrayed as, unpleasant, evil, responsible for all the problems of the world. They might think, hey, hang on, I thought we were meant to not judge people by skin color. Why are you doing that? And I think there's a backlash down the road from this. It may already have started, but that could be very ugly indeed, which is why I wish, again, to get back to the thing, I wish we could settle it equal.
You know, talking about backlash, how's the publication of this book, The Madness of Crowds, affected you personally? I mean, there's got to be a tremendous amount of pushback on a book like this.
Well, you know, it's very hard to say because, I mean, the reception has been terrific. It's been a bestseller. It's come out in multiple languages. I take some pride in, certainly for the second time in a row, writing a book which has had such a terrific public reception, because one of the best things for a writer is the sense that you're saying things that other people are thinking and helping mutually, as it were, to be able to think better out loud together. And so it's enormously rewarding. In some ways, you ask the wrong person, because maybe this is inevitable with certain types of writers, but I really can honestly say that I don't take any notice of criticisms that are not legitimate. I mean, if somebody said you've got this fact wrong, obviously I'd take notice of that if that were to happen. But when people just, I suppose, make allegations that, well, you're just saying this to, be a Nazi or something, I don't know. I mean, I've not read such a thing, but I don't take any notice of that. And I don't advise other people to take notice of it either. If anything, I've been surprised by the warmth of the reception across the political pond, because I was expecting more pushback. And I was struck for the second time in a row, actually, by how much warmer the water is than most people would think. And I think the reason for that is that what I'm writing about here is something that's on all of our minds. And I think a lot of people sense that we are landing into conclusions which we haven't really thought our way through. And so I found, at any rate, that people of all ages and backgrounds and races and everything else have sort of welcomed somebody thinking out loud about the most dangerous issues of our time. And for a writer, to be read is the greatest thing we can ask for. And I'm just delighted that so many people read me and they tell me a lot out of it. So I can't complain.
Well, I absolutely got a lot out of it. I want to transition into the last major topic of discussion in your book, and that's the transgender movement. And to talk about that, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I want to set up a story that you tell in the book, the story of Nathan Verhelst, who was born a girl, and at some point she decided that she would be better off if she were a he, and so she began partaking in hormone therapy. She had a double mastectomy, surgeries to construct a penis, and then after 3 major surgeries, Nathan was ready to celebrate his rebirth as a man. And Nathan looks into the mirror, and the result is disgust. A new breast not matching expectations, a new penis which had the symptoms of rejection. There was the scarring and then the mental depression. And so what was the solution? It was euthanasia. And the very last words of Verhelst were these: I do not want to be a monster. And so the Belgian Health Service tried to turn a girl into a boy or a woman into a man, failed, killed her, and this is all in the spirit of wokeness. And this is something that I alluded to earlier. This is a trans train that's roared into town in record time, far faster than any of the other trains that are on these social transformation tracks, and is ready to ram through and run over anyone who stands in its way. And yet, you have major publications like Time magazine calling this the next civil rights frontier.
That's right. Yes. A friend of mine who's a journalist some time ago helped me to elucidate part of this by saying to me, that, and I say this in the book, that we should always assume that, well, let me put it this way, every generation in history has done things that their successors look at and think, what were they thinking? Now, that is the case with every generation and every era. And we should assume, unless we've become uniquely good and virtuous in our lifetimes as a species entire, that we are doing things ourselves in our era which people who come after us will be amazed that we did without questioning. And so the job of a writer, as I see it in some ways, is to try to find out what those things might be and stop doing them earlier. I think that this may well be one such thing. The case of their health that you just cited is my absolute ground zero on that, because for a state in Western Europe in the 21st century to try to turn a woman into a man and then euthanize them on the state is a story in some ways so redolent and terrifying that I still don't think very many people want to linger over it. However, put away the euthanasia issue for a moment, which I've written about at length elsewhere at National Review, among other places, and just focus on this bit of the story of the trans bit. Yes, I think that one of the things that's making people so uneasy about the trans issue, and by the way, I should stress, I'm not trying to flame throw on any of this. I try in the trans chapter to lay out as carefully and as reasonably as possible what might be, in this area we know almost nothing about, what might be legitimate points and what are clearly illegitimate points. And I try really carefully. It's like brain surgery having to go through the trans thing. It is, you have to go through with such a fine comb, as it were, on it. Now, my view is that the reason why the trans issue has become so large is because, among other things, the claims that are being made are clearly disturbing to most people, and disturbing because they sense that we haven't really litigated this in public. In other words, I mentioned earlier, the idea that there are trans children, which is something I go into. It's a very, very distasteful and unpleasant subject, but it needs to be interrogated. It cannot be the case that we just accept that there are such people among us and that they can include children, and that therefore you transition somebody from, puberty onwards. You cannot, as a society, do that. And the reason, as I say, that so many people are disturbed by this is because, any parent knows that there's something off about this. Most people know that there is something off about the claims that are being made. That isn't to say there may be absolutely no claims in this area, but it's to say there is something that is being claimed which cannot be agreed to by reasonable people without in some way losing your own sense of intellectual self-respect.
And you also note that the irreversibility of this issue, you point out in the book that a gay person who goes straight or a straight person who goes gay is doing something that's reversible, but the hell of the transgender movement is that what they're doing early on to their bodies, and sometimes it starts at age 3, is irreversible and as such is life-altering, oftentimes resulting in suicide.
Well, the suicide rates, interestingly and appallingly, don't change whether people have the operations to transition or not. And the use of suicide as a sort of threat is a very troubling element in all of this. I've spoken to quite a lot of people who have gone through this. There are people, of course, who've gone through surgeries who are content, or at least happier, shall we say. But there are people as well, some of whom I've spoken to, one of whom in particular I quote in the book, who started doing this and then tried to go back, and did go back, but not without some seriously life-changing medical issues. I cite this because, yes, I think that one of the things, again, that parents, and I've spoken to American parents who've been going through some of the real trouble of this with their children, and it's a really harrowing story on occasions, in fact, always. One of the things that I think people sense is just that, we are being told to imbibe a set of claims, and we just rightly want to question them more. There are studies, there aren't many, but there are studies that show around 80 to 85% of children who have been put on some kind of, or children who've been claimed to have this thing so-called gender dysphoria, which itself is a very unclear thing, that about 80 to 85% of children diagnosed as having so-called gender dysphoria will grow up to be perfectly happy heterosexual or homosexual men and women, and that they're not in the wrong body, and they sort of get out of that phase. And for that to be the case, then, there should be some serious questioning about the idea that you should, for instance, give people puberty blockers as children in order to then more easily transition them surgically in adulthood. That is a massive thing to do about something we know so little about. And it means that we will be making mistakes now. The various centers in America in particular where this is happening are places where I think we will look back in not many years' time and say, how did they get away with doing that?
Particularly on the athletic field, where you have transgendered athletes who are allowed to compete against biological girls or women in what is very obviously an unfair fight.
Yes. I mean, there are various places this flares up, and that's one of them. And, put it this way, I mean, it's a sort of one-way street. I find very few people say, I thought the trans issue was complex, and now I think it's straightforward, and I don't see any rights violations against other groups by asserting trans rights very assertively. I only find the opposite. People saying, look, the more I look into this, the more uncomfortable I am about the assertions being made. And that tells us an awful lot.
From your perspective, what are some solutions as we move forward?
To this, all of these questions?
To all of this, to the madness of crowds.
Well, I give, as you know, towards the end, not to give them all away, a set of things we might do to try to push back against this madness. One of them is undoubtedly to try to get a better perspective of our own society, of other societies, and our own past. I urge people to do some shortcuts on this, and here is one that I advise. I mean, there are many, as you know, but one is this. Always ask when somebody makes claims about our society being, racist, patriarchal, cis, heteronormative, bigoted, homophobic, transphobic, etc., etc. Always ask compared to what and compared to where. There are assertions that are being made that are so ahistorical and, what's more, so deeply unfair to our societies that it has to be highlighted. Because, after all, what is being proposed by the social justice movement, the intersectionalists, and more, is a movement that has never been successfully tried or rolled out anywhere, a set of claims that have not been successfully rolled out anywhere, not even on very many campuses, and in fact on no campuses completely. So it would seem to me that it's very unwise to completely reorient all of Western society along the lines of an experiment that has never actually been tried, if there has never been a successful attempt to try it. And one of the things that I think is most needed is for people to say, look, actually, if you think we in America, for instance, are the most horribly bigoted society, where is good? Where is it that it's worked? And always to be suspicious of people who tell you about a utopia that's within easy reach, but who've never been there or anything like it, and who don't know really how they would get there. What we see in many of the claims that are made are just nakedly oppositional claims against America, against Britain. Basically, people who speak of our societies not as critics of them, but as enemies. And that needs to be highlighted, because so much of the language of this is presented as if it is purely a case of trying to improve us. But if that were the case, this rhetoric and the language, apart from anything else, would be nothing like as vindictive and vile as it has ended up becoming.
Douglas Murray, the title of the book, The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race, and Identity. A great title, a great subtitle, a great discussion. Really appreciate you writing this book. I haven't read The Strange Death of Europe yet, but it's on my desk. I'm eager to read it as soon as I possibly can. You are a very gifted writer, speaker, and it was a privilege to have you on Hank Unplugged.
It was a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. And for all of you listening in, if you're enjoying Hank Unplugged, make sure to leave a review. That will help us a lot in making sure that this gets to the earbuds of multiplied millions of more people around the world. Do remember this book is available for those who support the ministry. You can check it out on the web at equip.org, equip.org. And my thanks for your time as you listen to another edition of Hank Unplugged, where we are committed to bringing the most interesting, inspirational, and informative people on the planet direct to you. Thanks for tuning in. So long for now.